We're going to talk now about superstar Billy Graham and fortunately passing away. It was actually Ric Flair that was the first one that noted his passing. It was brought up on the AEW broadcast, and word now circulating about his passing. And once you heard the news that doctors want to take him off life support, I mean, sadly, it was just a question of when. That this news was going to be made public. But superstar Billy Graham, it's a very complex individual to break down. There was a lot of influential characteristics that were passed down from many of the biggest names and stars in the industry that took and stole from Billy Graham. There's also a lot of negativity that you can attach to superstar Billy Graham. This guy was not an angel throughout his life and was attached to a lot of controversy as well. He is somebody that was certainly not the first professional wrestler to use steroids, but it is a massive part of his legacy and was someone that was extremely open about his steroid abuse that led to decades of health problems that he believed. I mean, there was like a deadening of the bone that he dealt with, had to have ankle fusions, total hip replacements, and over the years, just health scare after health scare. In 2002, he was very close to death when he got a liver transplant after a 26-year-old woman was in a car accident, and she was a donor, and he was able to get a liver and ended up getting another 21 years out of his life. But Wei and I have been, detailing his health problems, and they've been going on all year long. He has spent most of this year in the hospital, and it's just been very sad. If you've seen any of the photos of him with the weight loss and with both him and his wife Valerie contracting COVID during this time. So Valerie had not been able to be visiting him in the hospital, and then seeing that update on Monday, really crushing if you were somebody that was a fan of superstar Billy Graham. And he grew up and was a pretty prominent in discus and shot put in high school. He grew up in Phoenix and won a version of Mr. America in the early 60s, and found bodybuilding at a pretty early in his teen years, and got into incredible shape and was into steroids at a pretty early tenure of them. Like he estimates it was probably around 1965 that he started steroid use, and that lasted until like 89, 90. So think about that. That's an incredible amount of time to be on that stuff, and he certainly paid the price of that. He was involved in football, going from the Calgary Stampeders to the Montreal Alouettes, and then it was another CFL player, Bob Luck, who sent him to Stu Hart, and that was how he got introduced to professional wrestling and was trained by Stu and made his debut pretty quickly in 1970. Stampede was his first territory, and then ended up going and meeting Dr. Jerry Graham. That's where he picked up the Graham name, and then later took on Superstar from Jesus Christ Superstar, the musical as well, and became like an outstanding heel. In LA, he was teaming with Jerry Graham. Then from there went to Roy Shire's promotion in San Francisco, and that's when he started teaming with Pat Patterson. And throughout the 70s, I mean, he became, it was Ed Farhat and superstar Billy Graham that became two of the dominant heels during that era. And he had an explosive run in San Francisco. He then went to the AWA. He went to Texas. He went to Hawaii. He traveled quite a bit. But the territory that I think most are going to focus on was his time working for Vince McMahon Sr. And he went there in the mid 70s and then left, came back. And that was when he was set up that he was going to win the championship. And Vince Sr. met with him it was around 1976 that he sat him down, and Vince Sr. had his whole booking set up that Bruno essentially wants out, and you're going to win the title on this date of April 30th, 1977, and you're going to hold it until February 20th, 1978. Like, he pretty much had it down to the date. So Graham goes into this run knowing exactly how long he's going to have it. And he was a huge draw in the Northeast. And throughout his career, he headlined the Garden 20 times, and he sold it out 19 of those 20 times. I mean, it's not the most sellouts. He wasn't at the level of like Bruno, but in terms of percentage, like no one had that percentage of sellouts. The only one he didn't was a card with Peter Maivia where they still drew over 17,000. And he is just doing red hot business as champion and as a heel. And his idea was, listen, I'm drawing like wildfire here. Let's keep this going. I can turn babyface. We can get another year or two out of this. But Vince Sr. was bound and determined to stay to his plan, and Bob Backlund would succeed him. And Backlund won the title as planned. And Backlund was a phenomenal drawing champion too. It wasn't as though he just dropped it and business plummeted. It did not. But it did certainly affect Graham. And for years, I remember interviewing him, and it was still like a tough pill for him to swallow that he was red hot. The title was taken from him, and he did stick around in the company until the end of the year. And then he went off and would make a comeback several years later. And during this period, there had been rumors that he had died, and then he comes back and he did a whole new gimmick as this doing this like martial arts gimmick, and it was dreadful. Like Graham would be the first to admit, like he was not a great pro wrestler. He had a great body, he had tremendous upper tier promos, but the wrestling was not what he hung his hat on. And when you took away the essence of what superstar Billy Graham was and placed him into this martial arts character, remarkably, he was still able to do business with Bob Backlund when he came back, but he was living off of the fumes of a prior era of superstar Billy Graham. And I mean, this was kind of like the lowest point of his in-ring career as this character. But at this point, this is when his body is starting to shut down. He would leave and go to Florida. Jim Crockett Promotions, he had a run in as well. And then he made like one last ditch effort to come back to the WWF. This is in the post expansion era during the Hogan era, but his hip was a mess coming back. He almost immediately required surgery that the WWF ended up paying for. And then apparently like took it out of his pay when he came back as well. And there was a source of contention there. And he did get one more Garden main event in 87 against Butch Reed that they did sell out. And then at that point, he just could not wrestle anymore. And they tried him out as a manager. He was a babyface manager, and that was greatly limiting. And then they put him on as a commentator. And you would think that Billy Graham would be like, here's one of the great talkers. He was dreadful as a broadcaster. If you go back to the very first SummerSlam, it is the ultimate, like, brother was the period at the end of every sentence in this 2.5 hour pay-per-view. And the man was just not equipped for commentary. So that was another position that they could not transition him to. And then eventually he was let go by the company, and he resurfaces in a big way during the whole early 90s set of scandals with the Ring Boy scandals, and being among the most vocal critics of the steroid use, and citing like 90% of guys in the industry are on steroids. And, you know, later he would patch things up with the WWF, and he kind of came back and just painted himself as, you know, I was bitter, I lied. And the problem with Billy Graham is that he was someone that damaged his own credibility. There were things he said that were, you know, of the steroid use. I mean, he was somebody that was extremely knowledgeable about it because of his extensive use of it. But it was hard to take this guy seriously when there were outright lies that he did state. And one of the most damaging that had that ended a friendship between the two was between him and Pat Patterson, when Graham went on the Phil Donahue show and he accused Pat Patterson of grabbing, of inappropriately touching one of the Ring Boys. And there were accusations against Pat Patterson, and from credible ones like Tom Cole, but you also had completely lies said about Pat Patterson by Billy Graham and by Murray Hodgson, which were false. And Graham in later years would apologize to Patterson, but Patterson never forgave him for this. Even when he was brought back into the WWF family, Patterson wanted nothing to do with this guy. And if you were lied about on national television, I don't think you could blame that reaction to things. But I think like that was like the negative side of Graham, was someone that I think shot himself in the foot a lot with his credibility, where he would state things that were so outlandish during this time period. If you go back, and things he said about Vince McMahon and about Hulk Hogan. And in the case of like Pat Patterson, I mean, someone that it was just hard to take him seriously. And therefore, you're sort of filtering the truth through the con, and that was the part where you kind of just throw everything out the window when you're trying to parse between those. And after that, like, it got very, very nasty between him and the company. They even spent this giant piece in a WWF magazine, pretty much just running down Billy Graham in '93. And then it was years later, after the liver transplant, when they did make amends, and he came in, and part of it was doing that Confidential series where he sat down for an interview, and it was pretty much just positioning like Vince, letting bygones be bygones, letting Graham come in, who he even called like a con man, but in like a comedic fashion. But that's what you're getting into with Billy. And essentially it was Billy just, having to, make amends and state this publicly. But came in, they did the whole Legends deal with him. They put him in the Hall of Fame. They did a book with him. They did a DVD with him, and then was under a Legends deal for several years. Then his Legends deal wasn't renewed, and he ended up selling his Hall of Fame ring, and would pop up. My understanding is that he was under a deal these last couple of years, but had taken, like, outside of the odd like videos that he would do, he had taken a much more kind of a subdued approach to the public side of things as well. But that's really just scratching the surface on Billy Graham. There is a lot that can be discussed regarding him that hopefully I'll get a chance to write about in the coming days. But this was a massive figure. If you grew up in the Northeast, or with the AWA as your territory you followed, or in California, many different territories, he was a major name, and he influenced Hogan. He influenced Jesse Ventura. Vince McMahon was a massive fan of this guy. Paul Levesque was a massive fan of him. Chael Sonnen was a huge fan of it. Like, he was somebody that, when you look at the prototype of so many guys that tried to emulate superstar Billy Graham, it was not just the promos, but it was the look. And you can certainly look at a positive influence he had, and also a negative influence that he had. Like, this became the look that so many guys aspired to, and many that destroyed their health to try and emulate. And this guy was sort of like their godfather in terms of that type of giant steroid look. And I mean, this was a guy that massacred his body. And for me, like, it is a bit of a miracle that he lived this long, when you look at the health issues he was having in the early 90s, and here we are in 2023. So obviously sympathies go out to his wife, Valerie, who was she had been married with him since she was 19, and she lived through all of this and then some. And the pill use, and the drug use, and the highs, the lows. She was there for all of it. So I imagine a devastating day for her as well. But that is a look at superstar Billy Graham.